Who was the first leader of independent Madagascar in 1960? Philibert Tsiranana. What crisis in 1967 blocked maritime routes through the Suez Canal, triggering war? Six-Day War. Who became Prime Minister of Italy after Matteo Renzi resigned in 2016? Paolo Gentiloni. Which African country experienced a conflict called the Casamance conflict starting in 1982? Senegal. Who was President of the United States during the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995? Bill Clinton. What was the movement against racial discrimination in South Africa led by Nelson Mandela? Anti-apartheid movement. Who succeeded Angela Merkel as leader of Germany's CDU party in 2018? Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer. Which nation experienced the failed military coup attempt on July 15, 2016? Turkey. Who became Prime Minister of Canada after Brian Mulroney resigned in 1993? Kim Campbell. What international conflict began in 2003 with the US-led invasion to remove Saddam Hussein? Iraq War. Who was Prime Minister of India during the 2008 Mumbai terror attacks? Manmohan Singh. What was the widespread anti-government protest in Brazil in 2013 called? June Journeys, Jornadas de Junho. Who was the President of Zimbabwe following the 2017 military intervention? Emerson Mnangagwa. Which Asian nation experienced violent communal riots in 2002 in Gujarat state? India. Who became the first female president of South Korea in 2013? Park Geun-hye. Which international agreement in 2016 aimed at resolving the Syrian civil war? Geneva Peace Talks. Who was Prime Minister of Japan during the 1995 Kobe earthquake? Tomichi Murayama. Which country faced a banking and economic collapse in 2008, known as the Kitchenware Revolution? Iceland. Who was the British Prime Minister during the signing of the Good Friday Agreement in 1998? Tony Blair. What international conference in 1994 focused on population and development? International Conference on Population and Development, Cairo Conference. Who became President of Argentina after Cristina Fernández de Kirchner in 2015? Mauricio Macri. What uprising in 2008 opposed Chinese rule and policies in Tibet? Tibetan unrest, 2008 Tibetan uprising. Who was President of Iran during the Green Movement protests of 2009? Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. What international agreement aimed at reducing nuclear proliferation was extended indefinitely in 1995? Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT. Who succeeded Hosni Mubarak immediately after Egypt's 2011 revolution? Mohammad Hussein Tantawi, Chairman of the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces. Which European country faced an economic crisis and adopted austerity measures between 2010 and 2015? Greece. Who became Prime Minister of Australia after Kevin Rudd in 2010? Julia Gillard. What international event focused on climate change negotiations in Copenhagen in 2009? COP15 Climate Summit. Who was the President of Nicaragua facing protests starting in 2018? Daniel Ortega. Which Asian country experienced a 2014 military coup led by General Prayut Chan-o-cha? Thailand. Who succeeded François Hollande as President of France in 2017? Emmanuel Macron. Which country was divided into two separate states in 1993 peacefully? Czechoslovakia, split into Czech Republic and Slovakia. Who became President of South Sudan when it gained independence in 2011? Salva Kiir Mayardit. What major natural disaster struck Haiti in January 2010? Haiti earthquake. Who succeeded David Cameron as UK Prime Minister in 2016? Theresa May. Which country saw the Umbrella Revolution protests in 2014? Hong Kong, China. Who was Prime Minister of Japan during the lost decade economic stagnation in the 1990s? Several Prime Ministers, notable among them Kiichi Miyazawa. Which African country experienced a military coup led by Captain Amadou Sanogo in 2012? Mali. Who became President of Colombia after Alvaro Uribe in 2010? Juan Manuel Santos. Which international court was established in 2002 to prosecute individuals for genocide and war crimes? International Criminal Court, ICC. Who was the President of Egypt during the Yom Kippur War in 1973? Anwar Sadat. Which nation saw a peaceful transition called the Tulip Revolution in 2005? Kyrgyzstan. Who was President of Rwanda before the genocide in 1994? Juvenal Habyarimana. What treaty signed in 1998 aimed to eliminate border controls among European Union members? Schengen Agreement. Who became the President of Turkey after Abdullah Gül in 2014? Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Which country saw violent conflict erupt in 2013 between President Kiir and Vice President Makka? South Sudan. Who was Prime Minister of Italy during the economic crisis in 2011? Mario Monti. What was the widespread political unrest in Venezuela beginning in 2014 known as? Venezuelan protests, La Salida. Who succeeded Dilma Rousseff as President of Brazil after impeachment in 2016? Michel Temer. Which country experienced the Arab Spring uprisings first in December 2010? Tunisia. Who was the leader of Libya overthrown during the Arab Spring in 2011? Muammar Gaddafi. Who was the leader of China after Jiang Zemin? Hu Jintao. Which European country experienced the Rose Revolution in 2003? Georgia. Who became the first president of post-communist Czech Republic in 1993? Václav Havel. Which conflict between Israel and Palestine occurred in the Gaza Strip in 2008-2009? Operation Cast-led, Gaza War. Who was president of the United States during the Kosovo conflict in 1999? Bill Clinton. Which international conference in 2001 addressed global racism and discrimination? Durban Conference, World Conference Against Racism. Who succeeded Vladimir Putin as president of Russia in 2008? Dmitry Medvedev. Which South American country faced political unrest leading to a 2019 resignation by President Evo Morales? Bolivia. Who became Prime Minister of the UK following Theresa May's resignation in 2019? Boris Johnson. Which Asian nation underwent economic reforms known as Doi Mua in the 1980s? Vietnam. Who was the dictator of Chile from 1973 to 1990? Augusto Pinochet. What was the political upheaval in Mexico following the 1994 Zapatista uprising called Chiapas conflict? Who became the leader of Syria after Hafez al-Assad's death in 2000? Bashar al-Assad. Which African country saw a coup attempt against President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in 2016? Turkey, country straddling Europe and Asia. Who was the first president of independent Slovenia in 1991? Milan Kunin. Which country experienced the Purple Revolution following the 2005 parliamentary elections? Iraq. Who succeeded François Mitterrand as president of France in 1995? Jacques Chirac. Which European country joined NATO in 2017, angering Russia? Montenegro. Who was Prime Minister of Australia during the Tampa refugee crisis in 2001? John Howard. What international climate accord did President Donald Trump withdraw from in 2017? Paris Agreement. Who became president of Guatemala after Otto Pérez Molina's resignation in 2015? Jimmy Morales. Which conflict began in Yemen following the Houthi takeover in 2014? Yemeni Civil War. Who became Prime Minister of New Zealand after John Key resigned in 2016? Bill English. Which Asian country experienced the Rohingya refugee crisis starting in 2017? Myanmar. Who succeeded Barack Obama as President of the United States? Donald Trump. What economic crisis occurred globally between 2007 and 2008? Global financial crisis, Great Recession. Who was the leader of Egypt overthrown by military coup in 2013? Mohamed Morsi. Which African country experienced significant unrest and protests against President Pierre Nkurunziza's third-term bid in 2015? Burundi. Who became Prime Minister of Pakistan in 2018? Imran Khan. What was the uprising in Egypt against Hosni Mubarak in 2011 called? January 25th Revolution, Egyptian Revolution. Who became President of Venezuela after Hugo Chávez's death? Nicolas Maduro. Which European nation experienced an economic collapse and a bank crisis in 2008? Iceland. Who became Prime Minister of Spain after Mariano Rajoy in 2018? Pedro Sanchez. What international event in 2011 saw NATO intervention in Libya? Libyan Civil War, Operation Unified Protector. Who succeeded Shinzo Abe as Prime Minister of Japan in 2020? Yoshihide Suga. Which Asian country experienced a military coup led by Min Aung Hlaing in 2021? Myanmar. Who became President of Ukraine after Petro Poroshenko in 2019? Volodymyr Zelensky. What international summit was held in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 addressing environmental issues? Earth Summit, Rio Summit. Who was the leader of Serbia indicted by the ICTY for war crimes during the Yugoslav wars? Slobodan Milosevic. Which country experienced violent anti-government protests in 2019 against President Sebastian Pinera? Chile. Who was the president of Sudan after Omar al-Bashir's overthrow in 2019? Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, Military Transitional Council. Which Asian country saw a major pro-democracy movement known as the Candlelight Revolution in 20,162,017? South Korea. Who became Prime Minister of Ethiopia in 2018? Abiy Ahmed. What conflict erupted in northern Ethiopia involving the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF? In 2020, Tigray War. Who became President of Brazil after Michel Temer in 2019? Jair Bolsonaro. Which African nation experienced a military coup in August 2020 removing President Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta? Mali. Who succeeded Theresa May as leader of the Conservative Party in the UK? Boris Johnson. What country held the Brexit referendum in 2016? United Kingdom. Who was the president of France during the Yellow Vest protests in 2018? 2019? Emmanuel Macron. Which European country faced significant political instability and government collapse in 2021? Italy. Who became the first woman to serve as president of the European Commission in 2019? Ursula von der Leyen. What event marked the US withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021? Fall of Kabul to the Taliban. Who became Chancellor of Germany after Angela Merkel in 2021? Olaf Scholz. Which Asian country experienced mass protests against a controversial extradition bill in 2019? Hong Kong, China. Who became Prime Minister of Israel in 2021, replacing Benjamin Netanyahu? Naftali Bennett. What was the international agreement signed in Morocco in 2018 addressing migration issues? Global Compact for Migration. Who was the leader of Ethiopia during the Eritrean-Ethiopian peace agreement in 2018? Abiy Ahmed. Which Latin American nation experienced mass protests in 2021 against President Ivan Duque's government? Colombia. Who succeeded Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister of Canada after the 2019 federal elections? Justin Trudeau, re-elected. Which country's parliament passed a controversial citizenship amendment in 2019, sparking widespread protests? India. Who was the first democratically elected president of Tunisia after the 2011 revolution? Monsef Marzouki. Which Asian nation saw a widespread political crackdown following a failed coup in 2016? Turkey. Who became the Prime Minister of Italy in 2018, heading a populist coalition? Giuseppe Conte. What year did Russia annex Crimea from Ukraine? In the year 2014. Who was the leader of Zimbabwe who resigned after military pressure in 2017? Robert Mugabe. What major disaster struck Beirut, Lebanon, in August 2020? Beirut port explosion. Who became Prime Minister of Japan after Yoshihide Suga resigned in 2021? Fumio Kishida. What event in 2021 saw a significant escalation between Israel and Hamas in Gaza? In 2021 Israel-Gaza conflict. Who was the president of Haiti assassinated in July 2021? Jovenel Moise. Which African nation experienced a civil conflict involving President Faustin Archange Touadera and rebels in 2020-2021? Central African Republic. Who became president of Bolivia after Janine Áñez's interim government in 2020? Luis Arce. Which Asian country saw mass protests against military rule known as the Spring Revolution in 2021? Myanmar. Who became the US president after Donald Trump? Joe Biden. Who became the first female vice president of the United States? Kamala Harris. Which Asian country faced massive protests over a security law imposed by China in 2020? Hong Kong. Who became the first female president of Tanzania in 2021? Samia Suluhu Hassan. What global health crisis began in late 2019 and escalated into a pandemic in 2020? COVID-19 pandemic. Which country held a highly controversial presidential election in 2020, leading to widespread protests? Belarus. Who became the president of Belarus in 1994 and remains in power despite protests? Alexander Lukashenko. Which military alliance marked its 70th anniversary in 2019? NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Who was the president of Russia during the 2022 invasion of Ukraine? Vladimir Putin. What is the name of the alliance formed between Australia, the UK, and the US in 2021? AUKUS. Who became the Prime Minister of Sweden in 2022? Ulf Kristersson. What environmental agreement succeeded the Kyoto Protocol in 2015? Paris Climate Agreement. Which country became the first to legalize Bitcoin as legal tender in 2021? El Salvador. Who was the president of the Philippines elected in 2022? Ferdinand Bongbong Marcos Jr. Which major world leader died in September 2022, ending a 70-year reign? Queen Elizabeth II. Who succeeded Queen Elizabeth II as monarch of the United Kingdom? King Charles III. Which European country experienced a rapid government collapse in 2022, leading to snap elections? Italy. Who was elected Prime Minister of the UK after Liz Truss resigned in 2022? Rishi Sunak. What is the name of the large-scale NATO exercise conducted in Eastern Europe in 2022? Defender Europe 22. Which country faced widespread protests and economic collapse leading to President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's resignation in 2022? Sri Lanka. Who became the Prime Minister of Israel again in 2022 after a brief hiatus? Benjamin Netanyahu. Which African country saw protests in a coup attempt against Paul Henry Sandaogo Damiba in 2022? Burkina Faso. Who became Chancellor of Germany following the 2021 federal elections? Olaf Scholz. What is the name of the global summit held in Glasgow in 2021 to address climate change? COP26. Which major tech company CEO stepped down in 2021 after more than 2 decades? Jeff Bezos, Amazon. What was the name of the US military withdrawal operation from Afghanistan in 2021? Operation Allies Refuge. Who became the Prime Minister of Finland in 2019? Sanna Marin. What was the name of the COVID-19 vaccination initiative co-led by who? COVAX. Which country rejoined the Paris Climate Accord under President Joe Biden in 2021? United States. Who was the first female head of the European Central Bank? Christine Lagarde. What massive canal project was proposed by Nicaragua as an alternative to the Panama Canal? Nicaragua Grand Canal, proposed but not constructed. Which country faced a truckers' protest known as the Freedom Convoy in early 2022? Canada. Who became president of South Korea in 2022, replacing Moon Jae-in? Yoon Suk-yeol. What is the name of the movement in Iran sparked by the death of Mahsa Amini in 2022? Women, Life, Freedom Movement. Who became Prime Minister of Japan in 2021? Fumio Kishida. Which nation hosted the FIFA World Cup in 2022? Qatar. Who was assassinated during an election campaign in Japan in 2022? Shinzo Abe. Which Asian country held its first democratic elections after a long civil war in 2022? Nepal. What new security pact was formed between India, Israel, UAE, and the US in 2021? I-Do-U-Do. Who became president of Brazil in 2023, defeating incumbent Jair Bolsonaro? Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Which country became the 31st member of NATO in 2023? Finland. Who became the first female Prime Minister of Italy? Giorgia Meloni. Which nation signed a historic peace agreement with Armenia in 2023? Azerbaijan. What is the name of the US legislation passed in 2022 to combat climate change and inflation? Inflation Reduction Act. Who won the 2023 Nobel Peace Prize for defending democracy in Iran? Marjaz Mohammadi. Which African country transitioned to civilian rule after military coups in the early 2020? Chad. What group led the insurgency in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado province? Ahlu Sunnah wa Jama, linked to ISIS. Which country experienced a large-scale farmers' protest from 2020 to 2021? India. Who succeeded Angela Merkel as leader of the CDU before the 2021 German elections? Armin Laschet. Which global campaign urged debt relief for poor nations during COVID-19? G20 Debt Service Suspension Initiative, DSSI. Who became the interim Prime Minister of Afghanistan after the Taliban takeover in 2021? Hassan Akhund. Which US Supreme Court decision was overturned in 2022, ending federal abortion rights? Roe v. Wade. Who became the youngest female Prime Minister of any country in the world in 2019? Sanna Marin, Finland. Which Southeast Asian country introduced a new capital city project called Nusantara? Indonesia. What trade agreement replaced NAFTA in 2020? United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, USMCA. Who was elected Prime Minister of Pakistan in 2022 after Imran Khan's ousting? Shehbaz Sharif. What African country experienced a constitutional crisis involving President Kais Saied in 2021? Tunisia. Which country's military blocked election results and staged a coup in 2021? Myanmar. What is the name of the world's largest free trade agreement signed in Asia in 2020? Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP. Who became President of the European Council in 2019? Charles Michel. What agreement did the UK and EU sign to manage post-Brexit trade relations? UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement. Which African country held its first peaceful power transition between elected leaders in 2017? Liberia. Who became Prime Minister of the Netherlands for a fourth term in 2022? Mark Rutte. What region in Spain held an independence referendum in 2017? Catalonia. Who was the President of the United States during the January 6, 2021 Capitol attack? Donald Trump. Which Russian opposition leader was poisoned in 2020? Alexei Navalny. Who became the President of France in 2017, defeating Marine Le Pen? Emmanuel Macron. Which international sports event was postponed from 2020 to 2021 due to the pandemic? Tokyo Olympics. Who became the first black woman to serve on the US Supreme Court in 2022? Ketanji Brown Jackson. What is the name of the climate agreement signed in 2015 in France? Paris Agreement. Who led the 2022 anti-lockdown protests in China? The protests were decentralized, known as White Paper Revolution. Which African country's president was killed in an attack in 2021? Haiti, Jovenel Moïse. What term refers to the increasing diplomatic competition between the US and China? Great Power Rivalry. Who became Prime Minister of Israel in late 2022, returning after a year out of office? Benjamin Netanyahu. Which country saw a deadly chemical explosion in Beirut in 2020? Lebanon. Who was the founder of the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1979? Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Which European country officially exited the European Union in 2020? United Kingdom. Who became the first woman president of Hungary in 2022? Katalin Novak. What Middle Eastern country restored relations with Iran in 2023 after China brokered talks? Saudi Arabia. Which country legalized same-sex marriage in 2022, becoming the first in Southeast Asia? Taiwan. Who became Prime Minister of the Czech Republic in 2021? Petr Fiala. Which European nation declared a state of emergency during the Belarus migrant crisis in 2021? Poland. Who became President of South Korea in 2022? Yoon Suk Yeol. Which country experienced Freedom Convoy protests in early 2022? Canada. What was the global agreement adopted in 2015 to end poverty and protect the planet? UN Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. Who became President of Nigeria in 2023? Bola Ahmed Tinubu. What is the name of the pro-democracy protests in Thailand in 2020? Free Youth Movement. Who became the first female leader of Ethiopia's Supreme Court? Miza Ashinafi. What is the name of the diplomatic alliance between India, Israel, UAE, and the US? IDO-UDO Group. Who became President of Colombia in 2022, the first leftist leader in the country? Gustavo Petro. Which African country faced civil war after the 2020 Tigray conflict? Ethiopia. Who became President of Kazakhstan after the 2022 unrest? Kassym-Jomart Tokayev. Which country was declared in famine by the UN in 2017 and again at risk in 2022? Somalia. Who is the current monarch of the United Kingdom as of 2023? King Charles III. What country faced a political deadlock after the 2022 parliamentary elections? Iraq. Which Latin American country adopted the US dollar as legal tender in 2000? Ecuador. Who led the World Health Organization during the COVID-19 pandemic? Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus. Which Asian country faced major protests in 2019 against a proposed extradition law? Hong Kong. What is the name of the military alliance formed in 1949 for collective defense? NATO. Who was the first female president of India? Pratibha Patil. What 1986 event led to major reforms in the Philippines? People Power Revolution. Who became President of the United States in 2021? Joe Biden. What country was divided into North and South after World War II? Korea. Who was the first Chancellor of Germany after reunification? Helmut Kohl. What international body replaced the League of Nations after World War II? United Nations. Which Asian country was partitioned in 1947? India. Who was the British Prime Minister during World War II? Winston Churchill. What was the global economic downturn during the 1930s called? The Great Depression. Who led the US during most of the Cold War's early years? Harry S. Truman. What was the name of the US strategy to contain communism? Truman Doctrine. Which war ended with the 1953 armistice but no peace treaty? Korean War. Who was the first president of the People's Republic of China? Mao Zedong. What was the Cold War era military alliance of the Soviet bloc? Warsaw Pact. Who was the US president during the fall of the Berlin Wall? George H.W. Bush. Which country launched the first artificial satellite? Sputnik. Soviet Union. Who was the leader of Nazi Germany during World War II? Adolf Hitler. What treaty ended World War I in 1919? Treaty of Versailles. Which empire collapsed after World War I, leading to the creation of modern Turkey? Ottoman Empire. Who founded the Republic of Turkey in 1923? Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. What economic plan aimed to rebuild Western Europe after World War II? Marshall Plan. Which US president implemented the New Deal? Franklin D. Roosevelt. What event marked the start of World War II in 1939? German invasion of Poland. Which battle is considered the turning point on the Eastern Front during World War II? Battle of Stalingrad. What was the name of the military alliance formed in 1949 to counter Soviet influence? NATO. What was the defensive military alliance formed by the Soviet Union and Eastern Bloc in 1955? Warsaw Pact. Who was the British Prime Minister who signed the Munich Agreement in 1938? Neville Chamberlain. Which US general led the Allied forces during the D-Day invasion? Dwight D. Eisenhower. What was the name of the US program that developed the atomic bomb? Manhattan Project. Which cities were targeted with atomic bombs in 1945? Hiroshima and Nagasaki. What trial prosecuted Nazi war criminals after World War II? Nuremberg trials. What US doctrine aimed to stop the spread of communism in 1947? Truman Doctrine. What war took place on the Korean Peninsula from 1950 to 1953? Korean War. Who succeeded Stalin as leader of the Soviet Union? Nikita Khrushchev. Which wall was built in 1961 to separate East and West Berlin? Berlin Wall. What was the Cold War crisis in 1962 involving Soviet missiles in Cuba? Cuban Missile Crisis. Who was the communist leader of Vietnam during the Vietnam War? Ho Chi Minh. Which 1968 offensive by the Viet Cong shocked US public opinion? Tet Offensive. What was the name of the 1972 Arms Limitation Agreement between the US and USSR? SALT-I. Which US president opened diplomatic relations with China in 1972? Richard Nixon. What global economic crisis occurred in 1973 due to an oil embargo? In 1973 oil crisis. Who was the founder of the People's Republic of China in 1949? Mao Zedong. What movement in China aimed to purge capitalist influences in the 1960s? Cultural Revolution. Who succeeded Mao Zedong as China's leader and began economic reforms? Deng Xiaoping. Which African country was formerly known as Rhodesia? Zimbabwe. Who was the first black president of South Africa? Nelson Mandela. What was the system of racial segregation in South Africa called? Apartheid. Which US president was forced to resign over the Watergate scandal? Richard Nixon. What policy aimed at easing Cold War tensions in the 1970s? Détente. Which Soviet leader introduced glasnost and perestroika? Mikhail Gorbachev. Which country led the Solidarity labor movement in the 1980s? Poland. What was the major 1986 nuclear disaster in the Soviet Union? Chernobyl. Which agreement in 1991 officially dissolved the Soviet Union? Belazar Accords. Who was the first president of post-Soviet Russia? Boris Yeltsin. Which war began when Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990? Gulf War. What peace agreement ended the Bosnian War in 1995? Dayton Accords. Who led Yugoslavia during the Balkan conflicts of the 1990s? Slobodan Milosevic. Which African country experienced genocide in 1994? Rwanda. Who was the monarch of the United Kingdom during World War II? King George V. Which country was created in 1948 as a homeland for Jews? Israel. Who was the Egyptian president nationalizing the Suez Canal in 1956? Jamal Abdel Nasser. Which war was fought between Israel and Arab states in 1967? Six-Day War. What Palestinian uprising began in 1987? First Intifada. Who was the longtime Libyan dictator overthrown in 2011? Muammar Gaddafi. Which US president ordered the invasion of Iraq in 2003? George W. Bush. Who was the mastermind behind the September 11th attacks? Osama bin Laden. What military operation was launched in Afghanistan in 2001? Operation Enduring Freedom. What global economic event began in 2008? Global financial crisis. Who was the first African American president of the US? Barack Obama. Which disease was declared a pandemic by WHO in March 2020? COVID-19. Who was the British Prime Minister during Brexit negotiations? Theresa May. Which leader unified Germany in the 19th century? Otto von Bismarck. What revolution led to the rise of the Soviet Union in 1917? Russian Revolution. Who led the Chinese Nationalist Party before fleeing to Taiwan? Chiang Kai-shek.